So once again, I am incredibly delighted and privileged to be here with all of you discussing this topic, which I'm very passionate about and which I think in very large ways encapsulates the entirety of the path very nicely. And I'm very grateful for this opportunity to do this overview of the interplay between the practice of the four immeasurables, which sometimes can appear to be something purely technical or just a feel-good practice, for example, between that on the one hand and the entirety of the Tibetan Buddhist path supposedly leading to full awakening or meant to lead us to full awakening on the other hand. So that's the general idea of what we're going to be discussing tonight, or depending on where you are this morning, this afternoon, this evening. And as usual, in my presentation, I will be relying on some slides. We will be doing some guided meditations, and I'm always welcoming any questions or observations that might arise, which I would then invite you to share in the chat. I will try to either respond to them immediately or to postpone my response until we reach the appropriate part of the presentation itself. And before we go into the material, I should, as always, remind everyone that I am in no way speaking from a place of authority. I myself am merely a Buddhist translator who's trying to do his best and mostly translating Buddhist Dharma between English and Russian. And in that capacity, I've had the privilege of accompanying many incredible teachers, serving them or working with them and their books and their articles and their recordings and so forth. So hopefully some of that has stayed with me and will now be incorporated in what I'm about to present. And another side of that is that I am certified trainer in several modalities, including cultivating emotional balance and some other systems. And from that point of view, I have had the experience of providing some basic meditation instructions to people. But I would in no way claim to be an experienced Dharma practitioner or a person who really understands the Dharma, any tradition of the Dharma, but especially Buddhist Dharma, which is so profound. And so my self-perception in these moments is always as the last and the worst student in class who was tasked with making a nice coherent presentation and putting some points together on the slides so that students who are much more experienced, much more intelligent, much more advanced can still benefit from the material itself. So it's in this capacity that I'm present here facilitating this class, not at all as a capital T teacher, but simply as someone who has received a lot of benefit from these practices and is committed to continuously exploring them throughout my life. And even though I'm looking forward to exploring these methods in the future, this talk is in a way a conclusion of a large cycle for me. And that part of that cycle is, of course, our summer course on the four immeasurables, which many of you have attended and I hope received some benefit from. So we'll start with a preliminary meditation on loving kindness. And of course, that would be preceded by allowing our body, speech, and mind to rest in a natural state in the union of stillness, silence, and spaciousness, or relaxation, stability, and clarity. So that from this profound state of ease, natural qualities of tender awareness and then loving kindness can manifest. And to do this practice, I would invite you to find a comfortable stationary position. For many of us, that would still be the position in which we're sitting upright, but some people might prefer to be in the supine position for this practice, especially if you've just had a long, hard workday. And then once we have established or found this comfortable position, once we have adjusted all the elements of the parts of our body accordingly, we can simply bring our awareness to the parts of the body that are in contact with the ground, with the element of earth beneath us. And we'll spend some time just observing all the sensations in those areas as we gradually, naturally release all types of physical tension. Allowing ourselves to breathe naturally, or allowing our body to control the breath without any intervention from the side of our mind, so that each inhalation, each exhalation can happen in their own accord, naturally, in an uncontrived manner, while we're still releasing tension from our feet and toes, our legs, our pelvic floor, and our abdominal area. First, finding ease in the lower half of our body. And then allowing that experience of ease to also extend to the upper part of the body, releasing tension so that our fingers are resting in complete stillness, relaxing our shoulders, and then exploring the sensations in our face, so that even all the facial muscles can rest in complete ease. Allowing these tactile waves associated with the breath to keep rushing through our body, removing all knots of tension. And with our body continuously finding greater and greater levels of ease, using our mind to generate a vast and positive motivation, both for this short meditation and for this entire class, by thinking of our highest spiritual or psychological aspirations. Those who are already firmly on the Tibetan Buddhist path would, of course, think of attaining full awakening for the benefit of all sentient beings. But if you're just here to learn about some of these curious concepts and perhaps see if any of these practices could be of any benefit, then the wording for your personal motivation can be quite different. But ideally, it would still be vast in that it includes the benefit of multiple beings. and profound in that it transcends simply the hedonic types of happiness available to us and includes the eudaimonic happiness born from profound states of inner balance. And then on the basis of this motivation, turning our awareness, turning our attention to our body and mind, to this very person sitting here practicing this, the person that we habitually perceive as me, that we refer to using some of our names or all of our names. This person that we're so deeply familiar with and yet often so inattentive towards. Well, now we're taking this opportunity to hold this person in gentle, tender awareness. Just like all the other beings, this person is a unique combination of different interdependent factors. An interplay, a process, a dance of different types of interdependence. And like all the other beings, this unique person has its own beauty. It has the incredible potential to grow and flourish. It has its vulnerability, its wish to be happy, to not suffer, to not be abandoned, to be held in love. And in attending to this vulnerable core, to these foundational desires, to this potential, we can just hold this person in warmth. Thus, accessing our quality of tenderness, or tsewa in Tibetan. Affectionate awareness, affectionate attention. And then, on the basis of this affectionate attention, we can generate a more specific state, the more specific state of loving kindness, an active wish for this person to experience happiness and its causes. Different types of happiness, not just the happiness that is hedonic in nature and comes from outer stimulation, but also the profound happiness of being, eudaimonic well-being. And so, holding ourselves in this tender awareness, we generate the wish. May I be happy and have the causes of happiness. Returning to this wish and holding it in our awareness, or perceiving this person through the lens of this aspiration. May I be happy and have the causes of happiness. It's also fine to say you, as if we were looking at this very person from the outside, wishing ourselves happiness and its causes as an outside observer. That would also be absolutely fine. But what we do need to do is to keep holding this aspiration and strengthening it gradually, softly, gently. And some people like to do that with the out-breath, as if breathing more life into this wish. May I be happy and have the causes of happiness. For a few moments, just to train in visionary awareness or in seeing what it now exists in potentiality, we can even imagine ourselves truly flourishing in all sorts of ways, truly experiencing both happiness and its causes. And then, with this inner warmth still present from this loving kindness projected towards ourselves, we can once again gently and slowly extend our awareness to other sentient beings, whether that's just other people present in this Zoom room with us or potentially watching this recording, or all sentient beings, or for now just the beings living on this planet, or physically present in the same building or the same area. Where in attending to these beings, we once again recognize how each one of them is a dance of interdependent factors with its own beauty, its potential, and its vulnerable desire to be happy and free. And so we first can hold these beings in just this gentle awareness, tenderness, warmth. And we then allow it to crystallize into loving kindness, expressing the wish May we have happiness and the causes of happiness. Or may we be happy and have the causes of happiness. Generating that wish, resting with it, and strengthening it with each new exhalation, if that feels comfortable for us. May we be happy and have the causes of happiness. Resting with this, breathing life into this wish, and transforming all of our mental energy into this type of awareness. Awareness directed towards all beings, holding them with this aspiration. And then for a few moments, imagining that all beings have attained a state of genuine flourishing, genuine well-being. So that the entire tapestry of life, the entire tapestry of interdependence is now completely different in that in this interdependent play, all beings enjoy genuine well-being. And then releasing all images, all thoughts, all aspirations to simply rest in spacious awareness, still perhaps pervaded with that warm glow, the glow of kindness. And then, out of this spacious, radiant glow, generating the thoughts, the active thoughts of dedication, dedicating the energy of this practice to, once again, our highest spiritual or psychological aspirations, which can, for those on the Buddhist path, include or be centered around full awakening for the benefit of all sentient beings. And then with that, slowly returning to our body to ground our awareness. Introducing some movement to the body by perhaps rocking back and forth or moving our fingers and toes. And then slowly, tenderly, concluding this practice and bringing our awareness back to this shared online space. Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to be guiding these practices. It's always a pleasure when some people receive or see some benefit in these, and I can absolutely, with honesty and not much humility, say that perhaps one of the most fulfilling experiences for me personally, in whatever limited skills I possess and whatever service I can offer, one of the most satisfying things for me is always facilitating extended retreats on loving kindness, because even doing 20 minutes of this practice can be quite nice. It is a feel-good practice in some ways, even though later on we are invited to fine-tune many of our mental functions so that we would experience genuine loving kindness, and not something that pretends to be kind but is actually controlling and possessive. So there is that work that needs to be done, absolutely. But still, it's a lovely practice, and it's transformative practice, not just for ourselves, but for the communities that we belong to, for the world, if we think about circles on the water and the overall interdependence of things. And when we get an opportunity to come together and do this type of practice for days on end, if not months or weeks, depending on what's available to us, that can be truly powerful. And as a personal note, before beginning the actual presentation and activating the slides, all of that, I should say that a large part of whatever I am able to offer now comes from having the privilege, and that's being privileged in terms of receiving these teachings, being privileged in terms of having that time and having the financial support to do that, but having had the privilege of doing retreats on these types of practices, that has been a very transformative part of my life. And as some people have heard before, perhaps, my life is sort of divided into two parts. And that's actually, for me, not before becoming ordained as a Buddhist monk and after. It's not so much that. It's actually before I did my first long-term loving kindness retreat and after. Because the kind of reparenting I had the opportunity to do in my first 2-month loving kindness retreat, the kind of trauma work in some ways, the kind of inner balancing, just settling down a little bit, becoming a little bit more chill, a little bit less neurotic, a little bit more attuned with my own basic goodness, a little bit more understanding of others, a tiny bit more empathetic, a tiny bit more ethical, hopefully. That was a very powerful and transformative experience that I've tried to continue working with since then, of course, guided by my incredible teachers, including Dr. Alan Wallace and many others, inspired by my root teacher, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and many other incredible Buddhist masters that I've had the fortune of meeting or interpreting for. But still, just knowing how lucky I am to, amongst all the various methods that the Buddhist tradition offers, to find something that really worked for me, that really brought about a lot of transformation for me. Because when I was looking at things I could do in that retreat, and I had some time, my wonderful Dharma friends were willing to take some of my work and do it for me while I was away and so forth. But when deciding what to practice, I could have settled on something completely different. And that could have been powerful and transformative, or not necessarily, who knows, this was the right choice somehow. And I think I naturally gravitated towards this because the teachings are so inspiring. And so we're just going to do an overview of these teachings in a way that would hopefully do two things. One, inspire us for the practice of four immeasurables, even if we're not using them in a Buddhist context, to use them in a secular modality, to use them in combination with any other spiritual or religious path. Still such a wonderful, incredible undertaking. And of course, there are practitioners of love, practitioners of compassion in all the traditions. And there are many practitioners who are not affiliated in this life with any particular tradition. So it's available to all of us. As Dr. Wallace sometimes says, this is universal Dharma, in that it is something completely available to all of us. The practices themselves are very simple, but the values or the qualities of love, compassion, and so forth also absolutely available to all of us and praised by all the great philosophical and religious traditions of the world. So it's something completely open to all beings, at least to those who have the privilege of having access to meditation, learning contemplative practice, and so forth. But we are in this group. We do have an opportunity to familiarize ourselves with all of this. So that's goal number one. And goal number two is doing an overview of the Tibetan Buddhist path. And for people who might be a bit new to that, or on the contrary, very deeply familiar with it, but have never thought about the interplay between loving kindness and the entirety of the path, compassion and the entirety of the path, there might be some value in that. So these are my two primary aspirations for this. So we'll turn to the slides now. And I hope you can see them. If at any point you experience any technical difficulties, please let us know in the chat. And of course, if questions come up and so forth, don't hesitate to use the chat option either. But four immeasurables and the Tibetan Buddhist path, that's the lofty name for this presentation. Lofty because even to talk about the beginnings or the foundations of the Tibetan Buddhist path is quite ambitious, but to try to describe the totality of it would be absolutely impossible were it not for the great compositions of incredible masters of this lineage or this tradition who have already summarized what's quintessential for us. So if I were to try to gather the essence of so many different texts and practices and systems, I would absolutely miserably, royally fail at that. But fortunately, there have been incredible yoginis and yogis who have done this work for us. That's what we're going to rely on. And fortunately, that's also the idea in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. We are free to do practices, to do these practices, to use these methods in accordance with our own unique context. We use these practices as appropriate. So if we have specific issues to attend to first, if we have specific problems to deal with, if we have specific aspirations to fulfill, of course, we can use these tools and weave a unique combination of them that is appropriate to us. So that's one side of things. But another side is that at no point in that process of weaving do we just start making random stuff up or mixing things up randomly. No more than we would be willing to do when cooking, where, of course, we are absolutely free to invent new recipes and cook new things, but we wouldn't be putting beef in the trifle. Indeed, there's common sense that is still applicable here. And in this case, part of that common sense is relying on the good advice or the good recommendations, the good psychology, the good teachings that have come from before and have been diligently and very actively tested by many generations of incredible practitioners. So the overall structure for this presentation would be as following. We have started with a preliminary meditation on loving kindness. So that's already done. Check. The next point is discussing the roots of the immeasurables and what lies at the root of these practices, not in terms of historical perspective. And we, during the longer 10-part course, have already discussed that, how, according to the early scriptures, Buddha has come to teach loving kindness for the first time and so forth. So that's not what we're focusing on. In this case, we'll talk about the depths of our mind and what's in the depths of our mind allows us to gradually manifest loving kindness, compassion, and so forth in an immeasurable manner. After that, we'll do an overview of the Tibetan Buddhist path by primarily relying on a very well-known, short, quintessential, pithy, beautiful, inspiring text known as Parting from the Four Clingings, which actually is not just one text, it's a body of different texts, a body of texts that have been translated into English and multiple other languages, have been taught all over the world so many times, including by Dr. Walls in his 8-week retreats. So many incredible teachings on this quintessential presentation of the path. But we will use it because it largely follows the same structure as many other texts and many other systems do. And I'll talk a little bit about that, but we have to rely on at least one specific presentation to be able to accomplish something in this session. So we'll use this one, but I will draw comparisons. I will explain the correspondences with other systems that might be more familiar, a bit more familiar to some of us present. But we'll use Parting from the Four Clingings as foundational text for this explanation. We'll talk about the role that loving kindness and so forth can play at each stage of the training that's explained in Parting from the Four Clingings. And then to just show how it's actually pretty much the same across all the formulations of the path, or all systems that describe the path in an orderly manner in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. We will also very briefly talk about a similar presentation known as the common and uncommon preliminaries, amondro, practices that come before, literally, or preparatory practices. We'll look at that because that system, once again, might be a bit more familiar for those who have been more actively in contact with the Nyingma or Kagyu lineages in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, or have ever visited centers of those lineages and have ever seen practice texts that do describe those preliminaries, and then have been told that these preliminaries are absolutely to be done if one is to become a proper practitioner. So we'll see how loving kindness can be absolutely, not can be integrated into that, is absolutely indispensable for all those steps, even when it seems to not be actively emphasized. If we don't bring loving kindness into the outer and inner or common and uncommon preliminaries, just like if loving kindness is missing in our attempts to work with Parting from the Four Clingings and any other similar system, we would most likely not move very far, because we will keep sabotaging our own progress. And that's one of the main things that for me have changed, or have become at least more obvious in my own very humble attempts at cultivating loving kindness, seeing how there needs to be a strong sense of tenderness and kindness and compassion and empathetic joy and equanimity towards our own person, and then by extension towards others, if we really want to successfully accomplish these very elaborate projects that have to do with inner transformation. Because if we really are not very benevolent towards ourselves, and of course not benevolent towards others either, it will be really difficult to do these things, because they are very elaborate. They are not easy to accomplish. They do take a lot of effort. And according to the Buddhist view, of course, they take lifetimes, if not hundreds of thousands of lifetimes. So there needs to be a basis of truly being committed to genuine well-being for ourselves and for others. And that's what we work with when we cultivate loving kindness and so forth. And then we'd conclude with a brief overview of the role that the four immeasurables can play in the advanced practices of Vajrayana in general, the 4 classes or the 6 classes of Buddhist Tantra, centered around the principle of deity yoga. We'll look at that a little bit. And then in Mahamudra, there are many styles of Mahamudra, but I'll give a very brief overview, the three main ones. And then, of course, in Dzogchen, which once again, for some practitioners present here, might be the very core of their spiritual path. And for others, might be something they're just remotely interested in. Oh, I've heard about such a thing. It sounds nice and fancy, but I don't think I'm quite there yet. And the point is not whether we're quite there yet. The point is whether we're actively trying to move in that direction. And that's absolutely something that's available to us if we choose to do so. So we'll look at that and the interplay between Dzogchen and loving kindness, Dzogchen and compassion. So to begin with, and I'll be quoting Garchen Rinpoche several times today, one of the incredible teachers I've had the privilege of both meeting and interpreting for a number of occasions, and a teacher who has very deeply affected my practice. Once again, one of the greatest yogis of our time. If you haven't seen the documentary about his life, freely available on Vimeo, we'll be including a link to it in the materials for the session for those of you who are registered for the Four Immeasurables course. And if not, I think we'll also add the link to the YouTube description for this session's recording. But the name of the documentary is For the Benefit of All Beings. So you can simply look for that on Vimeo. And in the meantime, I'll just quote from this incredible master who has truly fused his mind with love, compassion, and other beautiful qualities. And he says in a wonderful compilation of his quintessential teachings, available in English as a PDF file. Once again, there's a link for that as well. He says, "My single prayer is, may all sentient beings have happiness and love, the cause of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and self-grasping, the cause of suffering." In Tibetan, the word for kindness and love is jamtse. In Tibetan, ume script, and ume script is handwriting, essentially. Instead of block script, it's what you would use to write freely, as if you were writing in the same manner that you would write in your own actual handwriting in English. You would normally be using block letters all the time, right? So ume is that kind of fast script. In Tibetan ume script, this can be written in a single line. For me, this is a sign of this word's preciousness. Actually, in some cases, when students of Garchen Rinpoche produce cards with his quotes or some advice from him, or when they make refuge cards for those who have just taken Buddhist refuge with Garchen Rinpoche, they include a little image of his own handwriting of that word, which just does look just like a single stroke. But what Rinpoche points out here is that kindness and love are very intimately interconnected. Well, what's kindness and love? Because we could use these English words to translate any number of Sanskrit, Pali, or Tibetan original terms, right? Kindness, love, benevolence, friendliness. These words are used interchangeably, and sometimes they are translations of very, very different concepts. So what's the deal here? Well, there are two roots here in Jamtse, Jam and Se. You can see it in the Baili here, which also includes the silent letters, which are used in written Tibetan but are not pronounced. But Jamtse is the phonetic, and in this phonetic you see Jam and Se, Jampa and Tsewa. And these are very important qualities to familiarize ourselves with if we are to embark on the path of the Four Immeasurables, or if we're just to be practicing Dharma in general. And the first one actually to familiarize ourselves here is Tsewa, the second of these Tibetan roots. And Tsewa in general can be translated into English as love, or affection, or tenderness, or heartfelt warmth, or just warmth, but not, of course, meaning warmth as a physical condition. It refers to the warmth of our heart, quite literally. And then caring. And caring seems to be the preferred translation or the preferred term that His Holiness the Dalai Lama uses, because it simply refers to this term, this idea, this concept, this quality, refers to our foundational non-indifference our foundational caring as in we're not indifferent, we respond, we react to what's happening with us and to what's happening with other beings. So there is a movement in response to what the beings experience, and that includes what we experience ourselves. There's caring, we care, that's the idea there. But for us to care, there has to be a little bit of warmth or tenderness or affection, even if that caring or that non-indifference actually is concerned with beings we supposedly don't like, or we actually don't like in this life within these appearances. Even then, there is this non-indifference, there is this caring, there's that responsiveness. And it's actually because we care that we sometimes start misliking beings or groups of beings. And in some cases, everyone, just because we care so much that it becomes unbearable, and then we actively start hating everyone or trying to remove ourselves from everyone because we care too much. So it's this foundational quality of caring. And sometimes when His Holiness the Dalai Lama talks about it, actually quite often, he would talk about it from a biological point of view, talking about how we as especially mammals have this natural predisposition towards caring and companionship and kindness and warmth and all these sorts of pro-social things. There's that explanation, and His Holiness often quotes that because when talking to a secular audience, he needs to make references to something that would be common to many of us in today's secular world, and that's science, that's basic understanding of biology, that's the basics of social sciences and so forth. So those ideas are what he invokes when he talks about these things quite often. But on the other side of the spectrum, there's also the Buddhist understanding, which he never forces upon people, because he says Buddhist practice is, as opposed to Buddhist philosophy and Buddhist science, which are universal. They can be used by anyone interested in them, these systems of knowledge with regards to the nature of reality and what our mind consists of and how it functions and so forth. Buddhist practice, and cultivating love is part of Buddhist practice, that's for people who are interested in Buddhism. We don't have to sell it to everyone. We don't have to convert people or anything like that. So that he doesn't force that one on people, but the understanding, the basic understanding there is that this caring, tenderness, is part of our natural makeup. It's part of the nature of our mind. And much later, when we have moved through so many different explanations and we have reached the pinnacle of the Tibetan Buddhist path, the most advanced and profound of systems in some cases, and that's Dzogchen, but by extension, we could also use those adjectives for Mahamudra as well. There's a lot of parallels between Dzogchen and Mahamudra, and sometimes in some texts, Dzogchen is seen as a form of Mahamudra. When we reach that very profound level, somewhere there, and some teachers don't even mention those teachings or discourage students from going there or even thinking about them because they want to make sure their students have properly practiced the beginnings of the path. Even though some teachers do the exact opposite thing. They bring small elements, little gifts, little flowers from the very top, from the very end of the path, and introduce them right at the very beginning, because as Lama Thupten Yeshe used to say, having a little bit of taste of chocolate, getting that taste of chocolate from the onset would of course inspire us to continue walking along the path, instead of constantly waiting for, well, maybe if I walk another 100 miles, then I'll get a glimpse of freedom and peace, and maybe another 100 miles. And it's a never-ending chase after this carrot in a way, which can become a bit discouraging, even though, of course, changes are happening as we're walking the path. It's just different students, different teachers, different styles, so many different ways of presenting this material. But right there, at the end, there's an elaborate explanation of how tenderness is actually part of the most profound nature of our being. And we can see that reflected in perhaps also New Age thinking or in popular spirituality. And that's not to say it's bad or good, but as some people would know, the famous spiritual teacher by the name of Ram Dass, who in a way was one of the forefathers of both the psychedelic revolution and the popularity of Hinduism and Buddhism in modern-day America, Ram Dass, towards the end of his life, would mostly teach one simple practice, and that is considering ourselves to be loving awareness. Transforming our mind, our awareness, the state of our mind, into what he would call loving awareness. And that did not come out of nowhere. That was not only the result of his entire life's spiritual search, his own spiritual quest, that also came quite closely from the quintessential pith instructions of his Hindu teacher, Neem Karoli Baba, who was called a real bodhisattva by the 16th Karmapa, who was, of course, one of the greatest Tibetan Buddhist masters of the 20th century. So even though some people might say, oh, that's not Buddhism, as in, oh, they were not all wearing maroon robes and reading the Lamrim text by Tsongkhapa, that's not reason enough to discard that unless we have done proper checking. And the proper checking is to ask ourselves, well, can it be that we are actually loving awareness? And can the practice of being loving awareness bring some benefit? That's the question. Are there ever in Buddhist texts mentions that we are loving awareness? Well, for sure, even here. Our foundational nature includes a quality of caring, tenderness. And even though it's part of our natural nature, this caring, as we have seen in our first meditation today, can actually be strengthened by specific types of awareness that we apply in either daily life, so in informal meditation, or in our formal practice, whether that's on the cushion or in the supine position or in walking meditation and so forth. And what we do, and that's what we did in the first meditation today, is we direct our attention to the being in question. And usually that's this being right here, ourselves. And we just hold ourselves in gentle, tender, warm awareness, as if, I like that analogy, so I use that a lot in the practices that I sometimes facilitate, as if we were holding a puppy or a kitten or a newborn baby or a little rabbit, little bunny, with all the love of our heart. Just gently, tenderly, as if trying to project warmth, inner warmth. We're not yet actively saying, may you be happy. That would be loving kindness. That's the second root, jampa. It comes out of tsewa. It's before that, it's just caring. It's just being present. It's just being affectionate. So training in that is actually quite beneficial. And for many people, there's a lot of benefit in first applying that to themselves, to their body, or to their mind, or to themselves as a person. Because if we really, really dislike our body and mind, this person that's labeled on the basis of the body and mind, then going towards loving kindness and actively trying to repeat, may I have happiness and the causes of happiness, sort of trying to hypnotize ourselves into that, can be a bit complicated. I've seen a lot of benefit from first doing this tiny bit of tsewa practice, and then on the basis of that, just caring, just resting in this state of caring. And then on the basis of that, generating active loving kindness. And active loving kindness is the other root, as I've said, jampa. And that comes as a crystallization of caring. So as I've mentioned during the 10-part course, actually all of the 4 immeasurables, and those are loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, and equanimity, are different ways to crystallize our primordial ability to care into something appropriate for the situation. These are contextual manifestations of our primordial caring. And that, once again, will become very relevant when we reach the Dzogchen stage, the end of the path, sort of the end, because it can also be, for some people, the beginning, but end as in the ultimate pinnacle of Tibetan Buddhist teachings, sometimes referred to as the highest views, Mahamudra, Dzogchen, Great Middle Way, sometimes also the view of path and fruition, or Lamdre. Those are sometimes in Tibet, and especially in Eastern Tibet, and come amongst lineage holders there. These are sometimes called as the views or the highest views. And it is assumed that any practitioner on the Tibetan Buddhist path is a holder of one of these 4 views as their primary one. And then it is also said that these views are actually all the same. They boil down to the same thing. They're practiced in different ways, but they boil down to the same thing. So eventually, even if we're strongly resistant to the idea of, oh, Dzogchen, that's so advanced, or Mahamudra, that's very far along the way, or Great Middle Way, I'm not there yet, or Path and Fruition, that's for advanced people, I'm just starting. Eventually, our path is expected to be revolving around one of those views, knowing that one of these views would become our view towards reality, the view that we're trying to adopt fully to become a fully awakened Buddha. So while we're moving in that direction, we'll look at the four immeasurables themselves. And this is the version, beautiful translation, the beautiful version used by Shravasti Abbey. I'll just read it out. So for loving kindness, we would say, may all sentient beings have happiness and its causes. For compassion, may all sentient beings be free of suffering and its causes. For empathetic joy, may all sentient beings not be separated from sorrowless bliss. And finally, for equanimity, may all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free of bias, attachment, and anger. Right now, I'll not be going into any of the four immeasurables actually to talk about them deeply, because that's what the 10-part course was for. But beyond that, there are brilliant explanations, of course, available in English and in other languages, such as in Dr. Wallace's book by the name of Four Immeasurables, and in other beautiful sources that can be reused. But little comment here, of course, is that there are slight variations in how the four immeasurables, each of the four immeasurables, are described in different Buddhist lineages. So we would see some differences between, very largely speaking, Sanskrit lineage and the Pali lineage, especially with regards to empathetic joy and equanimity. But then within that, in the Sanskrit lineage, and the Sanskrit textual tradition, different authors would offer different presentations. Some variations also exist in the Pali tradition, but beyond that, in Tibet's own indigenous tradition of burn practice, there is also teachings on the four immeasurables also exist, and there are some differences between the Indo-Tibetan presentation of the four immeasurables and the Pön presentation that exists and is still practiced and transmitted in both Tibet itself and outside of Tibet right now. So we would see many, many different styles of practicing the four immeasurables, but usually they boil down to this, the same general idea, and there's not much variation when it comes to loving kindness and compassion. So these two are sometimes described or can be perceived as the root of it all, and then for equanimity and empathetic joy, a little bit variation exists here and there, but still the overall idea is the same. Empathetic joy means we need to have some joy that's empathetic. How we practice that, yes, that's described differently sometimes, but there needs to be some joy at least. And then for equanimity, well, something has to be equanimous, impartial, balanced, equalized. And there's a level of openness and stability to this quality that we're trying to cultivate, a level of wisdom as well. So those ideas are shared by all the traditions. But I will not be going into the four immeasurables themselves right now. Many of us are familiar with them in general, and of course, there's room for more in-depth exploration later on. But for now, it is even enough to say that loving kindness is an active wish for a sentient being to be happy and have the causes of happiness. Compassion is an active wish for a being to be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. Well, what are those then? Causes of happiness, causes of suffering. This is where we come to the very foundational teaching of Buddhism, the four truths for the Aryas, the four truths for noble beings, or the four noble truths as they're very colloquially referred to. And in that first teaching, which forms the structure for the entire Buddhist path, which forms the foundation, we see that the Buddha says that the causes of suffering, and this then would depend on which tradition we're following, are either craving and at the root of that delusion, or, for example, as is emphasized in the Tibetan tradition, afflictions or mental distortions, as Dr. Wallace sometimes translates that term, and karma. For suffering, of course, it's primarily negative karma, bad karma. So those are the actual causes of suffering. in terms of what unfolds in the bubble of our individual experiences, in our individual karmic field, in our individual projections that we call life or perceive as a reality. And while those are very valid and important to attend to, we could also, of course, then expand our thinking a little bit horizontally in terms of this life and think about the hedonic sources of suffering, which we still need to attend to. So systemic oppression, gender inequality, environmental destruction, heavy, incredible levels of corruption and economic problems of all sorts, a very, very problematic economic system that we exist within, or racism and all other types of xenophobic thinking and so forth. These things are not karma, and they're not in themselves afflictions. They are results of karma and afflictions, but in themselves, they're systemic imbalances. And so excluding these from the conversation is not actually a very good thing to do. First of all, because when we do exclude those things from our thinking and from our wishes and from our practice, we'd immediately appear to be incredibly privileged people who really don't care about the suffering of others much, but really want to only attain personal liberation or personal awakening and think that that can be done without trying to preserve this planet, trying to help others, trying to change the world for the better so that it is more equitable and more people actually have the privilege to be practicing all of this stuff. So we don't exclude that, ideally. Certainly His Holiness the Dalai Lama does not exclude those problems from his thinking, his prayers, his aspirations, and his work, his life's work of trying to make the world a better place. So we needn't exclude those things either, but at the same time, yes, of course, from the Buddhist point of view, is eventually we have to come back to the discussion centered around mental distortions and karma, and how mental distortions create in us the types of behavior that not only sow the seeds of negative karma, but also make us perpetuate all these types of systemic oppression. So that's the overall sequencing that we're following there. But Garchen Rinpoche presented us with an even shorter, quintessential teaching. He said that the cause of happiness is love, and he said that the cause of suffering is self-grasping. Well, that's quite interesting, because if we do stick to a very formalistic, a very formal interpretation, a very formulaic interpretation of the Tibetan Buddhist teachings, if we take up our Lamrim texts and we wave them in the air, we say, no, how dare you? Tsongkhapa says that it's just ignorance, and love cannot be the cause of happiness, especially not the ultimate happiness, because that cause has to be wisdom that's free from grasping at the reality of phenomena and person, and so forth. If we just think very narrowly, yes, Garchen Rinpoche's statement would appear to be merely a generalization that is not too precise, and for some people might even be misguiding. That's what we could say. But I actually don't think that's a helpful approach. I think it's actually very beneficial to think about the yogic experiences that Rinpoche might be talking from and about, and explore where there is actually incredible level of precision in what he says. So with regards to self-grasping, there wouldn't be much argument in the Buddhist tradition, because if we imagine that self-grasping here does not only refer to grasping at the self of an individual, but also means grasping at the self of phenomena as an inherent existence of phenomena, then actually most traditions, if not all traditions, would agree, well, yes, that is the cause of suffering eventually. After we're done with the layers of systemic oppression and negative behavior and mental distortions, we do come to this root of self-grasping or primordial ignorance, this basic misunderstanding, basic misinterpretation, active misinterpretation of reality. That's elaborately described in different systems of Buddhist epistemological teachings. That's what's studied in monastic universities when they study philosophy. How does all of this unfold? What's the self-grasping? How can we describe it? How to combat it? How to work with it? How long does it take? Well, it can take eons upon eons to work with it. That's valid, that's good, that's helpful. But then what about love? Because of course, everything would hinge on the definition here. And if love here is understood as something like romantic love, well, then no, it doesn't make any sense. Romantic love is obviously not always the cause of happiness. And sometimes it's the cause of major disasters. So Romeo and Juliet and multiple other examples, but even in our own personal life, loving hamburgers can lead us to major problems with our health. So it's not just love in general, it has to be something more specific. Well, what kind of love is Garchen Rinpoche describing here? From the context, we have to say he's talking about jamtse, kindness and love, as in tsewa, this primordial caring, and then the crystallizations that come out of that, which include jampa, which is loving kindness, but by extension should also include compassion, empathetic joy, and equanimity. So he's saying that for some reason, that all of that is the cause of happiness. And perhaps we can venture a guess, not just the relative happiness where we could experience loving kindness, do good deeds, create positive karma, that positive karma would ripen as good results in the future and so forth. Not just that, but somehow also the ultimate happiness of awakening. Well, how does that work? That's what we explore. So we could then do an overview of the Tibetan Buddhist path by following multiple textual traditions. And in the Tibetan Buddhist world, were we to come to the Tibetan Buddhist world and look at it, we would see multiple presentations of the path. There are multiple traditions, there are multiple lineages, multiple schools. And when we come to these different schools, sometimes even one school has multiple presentations of the path. And of course, all schools have their own presentations. And sometimes one presentation is shared by several schools or lineages. So it becomes very confusing if we think they're all mutually exclusive or different in major ways. And they're not. They're not mutually exclusive, and they're not profoundly different, even though there is integrity to each one of them. And it's advisable to look at them in their own beauty without trying to immediately mix them all up into a big bowl of quite unappetizing soup. So His Holiness the Dalai Lama is an incredible example of a master of all these presentations, all of these traditions, who is able to describe each one of them uniquely according to the rules of each specific system, and yet point out all the parallels. And those are endless in number. There are so many parallels that in a way, all these presentations can be said to boil down to the same point. So we're going to use just one of those as an example, but here are the names of some of these major presentations, and some might sound familiar. So graduate stages of the path, Lamrim, the major or main, one of the main teachings in the Gelug tradition established by Tsongkhapa, but not the only one actually that exists in that tradition. There are others within that same tradition. There are other ways to describe the entire path, and yet that's one of them. Then 3 visions and 3 tantras, which is a presentation of the path usually taught in the context of Lamdre teachings, the path and fruition teachings of the Sakya tradition. So yet another presentation. 3 visions refer to the exoteric path, 3 tantras to the esoteric path, and together they are covering the entirety of our path to awakening. Then 3 principal aspects of the path, a beautiful short text by Tsongkhapa, the founder of the Gelug tradition, but also quite popular in other lineages because the great non-sectarian master of the 19th century by the name of Jamgon Kongtrul, the great Jamgon Kongtrul, there have been many Kongtruls since then, but the great Jamgon Kongtrul wrote a nice pithy commentary on that text. And since then, 3 principal aspects of the path have also been taught and practiced in the Kagyu school. And by extension, because Kagyu school sometimes merges with the Nyingma school, some Nyingma masters as well have referred to this text. And this tradition just brings down all there is on the path to 3 simple points, or 3 simple qualities to cultivate. A very similar approach, but centered around 4 points, is parting from the 4 clingings. That's the one we're going to use as an example right now. And yet, beyond, that's not all there is to it. There is also an approach called the 4 Dharmas of Gampopa, which also brings everything down to 4 points, but those points are slightly different from parting from the four clingings. Essentially, we're talking about different ways of cutting up the same cake. So we can cut up the cake into many pieces, and that's going to be the graduated stages of the path. We could, roughly speaking, cut the cake into 6 pieces. That's 3 visions and 3 tantras, or just 3 very large pieces that would be difficult to stomach straight away. But you can try, and those are 3 principal aspects of the path. Some people absolutely have succeeded in just relying on that one text. Then parting from the 4 clingings. Well, that makes a little bit more sense, right? You cut the cake in half, and then in half again. And as I'm saying this, I'm starting to crave cake. Then mind training in 7 points. Well, that's a text that so many masters have taught over the years in the West so many times. And of course, the Contemplative Consciousness Network is hosting a retreat with Lama Alan Wallace, where he will be teaching this presentation, this way of cutting up the entire cake, the entire path, into 7 pieces. Then common and uncommon preliminaries. Strictly, roughly, there are 4 common preliminaries and then 4 or 5 uncommon, sometimes more, sometimes less, but usually 4 or 5. So we get 9 pieces or 8 pieces. That's also really straightforward. And so forth. This is not in any way an exhaustive list. We could go on and on and on and on and on. But then, were we to study all of these presentations, at least in brief, we would see that they're all parallel to each other. They run parallel to each other. They use all the same contemplations, all the same practices, all the same ideas. Slightly different styles, but the same sequencing. And that's important to recognize as we go to look at the 4 clingings that we're supposed to part from. So this is the root text of parting from the 4 clingings, and the root text was received by one of the founding fathers of the Sakya tradition in a pure vision of the Buddha of wisdom, Manjushri, sometimes also described as the Bodhisattva of wisdom, even though some sutras clearly say that he is actually a Buddha, but he appears as a Bodhisattva to continue inspiring us on the path. So Manjushri, being just the archetypal expression of wisdom in our own basic goodness, appears to this great master by the name of Sachen Kunen Nimpo, and presents to him this teaching, just these 4 lines, which have been since then a quintessential element of the Sakya tradition, but also have been taught in many other traditions. And I have listened to teachings on this text from masters of all the major lineages, I should say, despite, regardless of their affiliation with this school or that school, this tradition or that tradition. This text is so universal that I've heard teachings on it from pretty much all major sources. And this is what it says. If you're attached to this life, you're not a practitioner. You're not even a practitioner. Okay, fair. And then if you're attached to samsara, that's not renunciation. The reason I'm using italics here is that sometimes this negation is translated as there's no renunciation, and then for the remaining lines, there's no bodhicitta, and then there's no view, or you don't have the view. That's permissible, and of course, each translator uses their own way of doing things, but the Tibetan word used in these lines is min instead of me. So it does not negate the presence of something. It's not negating that. It's not negating the presence of renunciation. It's not, strictly speaking, saying that the renunciation is not present. What it's saying, grammatically speaking, grammar-wise, is that our mind state is not renunciation. Our attitude is not renunciation. Essentially, that's not renunciation. If you're attached to your own self-interest, that's not bodhicitta. That's what it says grammar-wise. And if grasping arises, that's not the view. Is it okay to translate it the other way, to say there's no view, there's no bodhicitta, there's no renunciation? Yeah, absolutely. But I think this tiny element of precision here actually is quite beautiful, because it talks about what our mental energy is shaped into. Eventually, the energy of our awareness, the luminosity and cognizance of our awareness, can be shaped into or released into Buddhahood. Were we to cut all the strings that bind our mental energy into this little bubble of a human being that we see ourselves as, were we to cut all the strings, it would open up into limitless, luminous expanse of Buddhahood. However, right now, we are binding ourselves into this very little being, and we're very seriously believing ourselves to be this little bubble. So even to say, as Ramdas does, I am loving awareness is actually a huge step, because it means that we see ourselves as something bigger than just the miserable, as Lama Thubten Yeshe used to call it, poor quality or self-pity me, this little miserable being. So to see beyond that is the eventual goal of these 4 lines. But while they are sometimes just taught as an inspiring idea or an inspiring reminder, actually there are specific contemplations associated with them. And Gorampa, who, well, before we go into that, this is how these 4 lines correspond to the 3 major divisions of the path as described in the Gelug tradition in its stages of the path literature or in its Lamrim teachings. Of course, very often taught by His Holiness the Dalai Lama and many other masters trained originally in that lineage. So the first line would correspond to the path in common with small scope practitioners. So the beginning of the path, or as one of my teachers, Venerable Rabbeinu Kurtin, calls it, kindergarten or junior school. If you're attached to this life, you're not a practitioner. So we graduate from kindergarten or junior school when we cease to be attached to this life, or at least when we've really transformed our mind so that there's very little grasping left towards this life, and then we do become a genuine practitioner. Practitioner not just as someone who sits down, closes their eyes, meditates a little bit, but a practitioner that is truly practicing the Dharma in a proper manner. So there's that. Aspirationally, would I one day, I'm talking about myself right now, would I one day want to be a genuine practitioner? So that when I don't know, when I'm on my cremation pyre, people say, yes, towards the end of his life, he really did become an actual practitioner, would be lovely. Not just because, wow, good reputation, people are calling me a practitioner. No, it would actually be good to be a practitioner from the inside. And if that inspires someone else, sure, but the main transformation has to be on the inside. That's what it says in the 7-point mind training. Between the 2 witnesses, the main one is us. We're the main person to really see whether we have become a true practitioner after a lot of work. So there's that, and then we enter middle school, or path in common with middling capacity practitioners. And this is where we work on renunciation of samsara in general. So if they are attached to samsara, that's not renunciation. We work on that. And then when we enter the path of advanced practitioners or great scope practitioners, we work with the last 2 lines. If you're attached to your own self-interest, that's not bodhicitta. If grasping arises, that's not the view. However, all the 4 lines are interpenetrating, because even before we begin actual practices associated with the first line, we're already invited to generate some facsimile of bodhicitta. But wait a minute, bodhicitta was right there at the end, or almost at the end. Even as we're practicing these beginning stages, we're invited to sometimes think about the emptiness of object, subject, and action. Well, shouldn't we only be doing that when we reach the last line? No, everything is interpenetrating. And although the main emphasis is on the beginning stages, more advanced practices are already creeping in. And that's why actually, even when we're saying, oh no, Dzogchen, that's only for very advanced practitioners. Well, Dzogchen is just the last line. The last line here includes the practice of Dzogchen for those who want to practice the last line as Dzogchen, as opposed to Mahamudra and or some other stuff. And then because of these lines are interpenetrating, elements of different practices do come in at different stages, at all the stages of the path. The issue, however, is using those elements skillfully and not haphazardly, not randomly, not making a mess of it, but truly being graceful and elegant with it. That's the challenge, and that's the learning. So the learning then continues when we think of the actual practices associated with these stages. And this is what Gorampa, one of the great scholars and practitioners of the Sakya path and one of the opponents of Tsongkhapa, this is what he suggests for these stages. So for this first line, if you're attached to this life, you're not a practitioner, Gorampa invites us to meditate analytically mostly, but then we do a little bit of resting meditation, concentration meditation. We meditate on the difficulty of finding a perfect human rebirth. So we do all sorts of meditations on how perfect our current opportunity is. And although, yes, eventually we want to explode into the boundless awareness of a Buddha, we need to also appreciate this bubble of who we are right now. As Dr. Alex Berzin sometimes explains it, we do need to first create a healthy sense of self, so that then we can eventually see through that self into its empty nature. But if we have only a very miserable sense of self, and if we're very deeply traumatized, we're very emotionally damaged, we're very neurotic, we're absolutely dishonest with ourselves and others, and so forth, well, that will not be too helpful. So where does loving kindness come in? Well, first of all, loving kindness comes in that even to begin these contemplations, we need to aspire for genuine well-being, for genuine happiness. And the more we meditate on our wish to be happy and attain the causes of happiness, the more inspired we would be to work with these meditations. But with this first meditation of finding perfect human rebirth and appreciating it, we literally tell ourselves, wow, I have this perfect human rebirth. In it, while I'll still have it, may I find genuine happiness. Then in the next one, we meditate on death and impermanence, and especially our own mortality, so that we understand that we need to plant seeds for the future, and urgently so, right now, before this karmic appearance ends and the next life begins, which might be very unexpected for us. Before that happens, we need to sow good seeds. So some of those good seeds are the seeds that are sown by practices of loving kindness, compassion, and so forth, and the ethics that come from having loving kindness and compassion. If we have zero loving kindness, zero compassion, zero empathy, and so forth, we would only be capable of psychopathic behavior. And that would not at all help us prepare for death and dying. So we do need those, but also we need to have loving kindness for ourselves to think, well, yes, I'm going to die, and then what? And to say, and then I also want to be happy, not just now, but then as well. So that requires strong levels of loving kindness. And as we continue cultivating them, we ask ourselves, for ourselves now. At this stage, it's primarily just wishing the best for ourselves. We know I'm going to die. I want myself to be happy. What can I do? I need to prepare for these future lives, which of course in Buddhist understanding are absolutely coming. How can I prepare myself? I need to meditate on karma and its fruits or its results, and I need to start working with my karma by creating positive causes, purifying negative causes, removing negative habits, and so forth. In the Gelugpa presentation, there would also be a meditation on refuge in before karma and its fruits, and sometimes also separate meditation on lower realms and how horrible it would be to have those karmic appearances. But Gurampa sort of essentializes all of this into these three key points. So we can expand it or we can collapse it into these three. And refuge still comes in here because before each session of meditation, Gurampa invites us to do a little bit of refuge meditation and also to generate in advance a vast motivation of bodhicitta. And bodhicitta, of course, is an extension of the four measurables, a quintessential expression of them, their union, their final fruition. So from the onset, four measurables are right here, especially directed towards ourselves. If I'm really compassionate with myself, if I'm really kind with myself, and I have the view of past and future lives and karma, I would want to do all these practices and really fine-tune my mind, but also fine-tune my sense of self so that I don't think of myself as garbage, I don't feel that I'm garbage, and therefore I'm not ruining my chances at becoming happy just because I don't believe that this garbage person, that is me, deserves happiness. So if we have this very poor view of ourselves and very little loving kindness for ourselves, none of this would actually work. Or we can try, and we should try, but it would be more balanced if we spend a little bit of time, at least a little bit of time, working with tenderness for ourselves and kindness for ourselves. And on the basis of that, then saying, yes, I do have a precious human rebirth. I do need to consider my mortality, and I do need to pay close attention to my karmic causes and results. And then with that, this is an important point to discuss in the brief, the karma created each time we practice the four immeasurables. So the four immeasurables are a wonderful illustration for the four types of loving kindness. Oh, sorry, four types of karmic results that we actually create with each action that is complete. A more detailed discussion of that, or more detailed explanation of that, can be found in appropriate literature, whether on Study Buddhism website, studybuddhism.com, or in books co-written by His Holiness the Dalai Lama and Venerable Thupten Chodron, or in other Buddhist books on karma. But I'm just going to give a very brief overview. Essentially, when our actions are complete and that they are accompanied by a number of different conditions, they bring about four results. And in this presentation, which comes from Jigme Lingpa, the way these results are described is actually slightly different. If we compare this presentation against the Gelugpa presentation, we would say that here Jigme Lingpa gives 5 results instead of 4. But what's important is that if we are truly practicing loving kindness, we're sowing the seeds for these 4 or 5 results every time, which is actually incredible news. Today we did this loving kindness meditation. We did it genuinely, as in, why wouldn't we? Loving kindness is great. And then we created the causes for all of this to come to fruition one day. So what would come to fruition on the basis of these karmic seeds? So Jigme Lingpa, as usual, translated by Padmakara Translation Group, published by Shambhala Publications, says here, Jigme Lingpa, one of the greatest contemplatives in the Nyingma lineage, incredible yogi. I talked about him a lot in the 10-part course. He says, by meditating in this way, we will, as ripened fruit, gain high rebirth among desirum gods or humankind, and then enlightenment itself. So first result, on the basis of these karmic seeds, if they get activated in the process of our dying, we will get at least a good rebirth. So either as samsara gods, not gods in the ultimate sense, but like Thor and the rest of Marvel gang, or Zeus and Brahma and all the other fun people of that capacity, of that in those shiny, brilliant forms that have a lot of fun, or as humans, which actually in Buddhist tradition is often described as preferable. Or for those who are practicing also Pure Land methods, they would get Pure Land rebirth. Although Pure Land rebirth needs a number of other factors. It's not enough to just meditate on loving kindness. But that's also available to us. So we'd get that, and eventually we would get enlightenment itself, eventually, in the long run, or soon, depending on how actively we're practicing. So that's one, good rebirth. Then, according to effects resembling their causes, we will actively continue in the practice. That's one part of effects resembling their causes. We will have the habit of practicing loving kindness, meditating on it, and expressing it in action. And we know some people are born with loving kindness. They're very loving, or very compassionate, or empathetically joyful, or equanimous. Wow, how amazing to be born with those tendencies instead of the tendency to kill insects, and then animals, and then whales, and then humans. Those would be pretty bad to have, but we can come in with these positive tendencies. And the other side of this effect, we will experience happiness untroubled by adversity. And there's a more elaborate explanation of the karmic results that loving kindness brings about, along with the other immeasurables, sometimes elaborately described as being likable to others, literally have the aura of being likable to others. But beyond that, also have a pleasant appearance. Why? Because our karmic energy, and Dr. Wallace goes into a lot of detail on that in his book, Mind in the Balance. The karmic energy, sometimes referred to in some systems as jiva or sog, and not all systems use this explanation, but sometimes some systems do, and then they explain how our karmic energy shapes our body into those forms that might be very good looking. And wouldn't that be nice? Because that gives us ability to help others, as long as we don't get lost in our good looks and how easy things are for us then, as long as we keep the intelligence around that, and humility, and an understanding of our privilege and so forth. So all of that, and also just if we wish for others to be safe and kind and happy, those are the experiences we will be getting. Then, through the conditioning effect, also sometimes known as the environmental effect, we will be happy in a pleasant dwelling place. So even if we do get a reborn back on Earth, where do we want to be reborn? in pleasant places, unpleasant places, war-torn places, peaceful places, places with forests, deserts, and so forth. All of that is determined by this specific aspect of karmic maturation. And loving kindness would be pushing us towards more pleasant environments. Sometimes for some people, all of this can happen in the same respect, except for rebirth. All of that, when their practice is truly powerful, all that can ripen in the same lifetime. If it doesn't, and many of it wouldn't, but some would or might, if it doesn't, it will then be projected into future lifetimes. All depends on the intensity of our practice and many secondary conditions, but some of it might sip into this very lifetime already. And then this is the one that Jigme Lingpa describes that's not usually mentioned in some other explanations: increasing fruit. Through the increasing fruit, the strength of the four immeasurable attitudes will prosper, and related to the twofold goal, that is the goal of others, the benefit of others and our own benefit, will every virtuous quality be gained. So Jigme Lingpa is saying that the energy of love, compassion, and so forth in our mind will keep flourishing, unfolding, encompassing everything, and will bring the ultimate benefit for ourselves and others. And twofold goal is actually attaining the state of Buddhahood, where we have the ability to boundlessly help others and the ability to revel in bliss, because that's what Buddhas do. They revel in bliss. Robert Thurman talks a lot about that in his latest book. But beyond that, as these beings are free and blissful, and their bliss is freedom, they can effortlessly manifest bodies and forms and energetic appearances for the benefit of others, skillfully, boundlessly, transcendently, guiding all beings to full awakening. That would be a state very different from perceiving ourselves to be a teeny tiny human on the face of this rock rushing through the universe, right? And saying, I am loving awareness, it's not perhaps the full experience of that, but it's at least trying to connect ourselves to that potentiality, to imagine it, to bring it a bit closer to our current experience, and then to continue gathering all the causes if we're following the approach of cultivation, or to continue removing all the obstacles to this flourishing, to this fruition, if we follow the approach of discovery. And Buddhism has both of these styles, both of these interpretations of our Buddha nature, of our basic goodness, where one interpretation says we need to cultivate stuff, gather qualities, strengthen these muscles, gather their accumulations. And the other approach says we need to remove everything that's standing in the way, but the perfection is already there. And philosophically speaking, these approaches often come to odds with each other, argue and they bicker and they write texts and then say letters, trying to disparage the opponent's intellectual capacity and say, no, it's all wrong. It's going to confuse beings. That's not correct. They're going to get lazy if they believe that they're already perfect. And then the other side says they're going to get despondent if all you're telling them is that they're going to need working 50 billion eons and they don't already have their perfection. But those are the great debates. In actual practice for yogis, such as Garchen Rinpoche, no difference. We still need to do all the same practices, and we can still experience all the same joys. It's just different people have different propensities. And there's also some beauty in combining the two approaches skillfully, which many of masters of the past have done successfully. So with the karma, every time we practice four immeasurables, we get all these results eventually. We sow seeds. We sow the seeds to get these results. Isn't that incredible if we think about karma in general? And yes, beyond that, Tibetan tradition teaches us many methods for purifying our karma, not at all limited to practice of confession to the 35 Buddhas, not at all limited to Vajrasattva practices. There are purification practices associated with Para and Medicine Buddha and all the other Buddha figures and so forth. And beyond that, purification practices that are just loving kindness and so forth, but done in a specific way, done to purify negative karmic seeds and to establish positive karmic seeds. But even if we don't think about purification, when we just do these methods, even in a completely secular approach, we're gathering all these seeds. So that's a Buddhist trick, essentially Buddhist trick for promoting wellness in the world, in that people might not believe in karma or might never consider karma. But if we teach them, if we inspire beings to practice the four immeasurables, and of course also things like mindfulness and concentration and wisdom and all of that, we help them gather these causes that would change their experience, that would change their personality, that would change their habits, and also change the entire world. So from that point of view, when Garchen Rinpoche is sometimes asked about things like climate change and so forth, he doesn't say we shouldn't be doing outer things that are necessary, but he often talks about how it's also important to be generating bodhicitta in our mind and all these beautiful mental states, because without them, outer change alone would not follow. So we need both. And with that, we then continue to the middling stage of the path. Eventually, we start practicing more actively with the second line in parting from the four clingings, where it says, if you're attached to samsara, that's not renunciation. Our attitude, our mental state is not renunciation. And of course, as we know, renunciation, translated by Lama Almolas as spirit of emergence, sometimes just this wish to emerge from suffering, step away from samsara, transcend samsara, no longer be living in this nightmare. But not because we die and disappear, just because we know this, we suddenly realize the nature of this nightmare and we get lucid in the dream, right? So the wish to do that is renunciation. And it's not enough to just have the wish to transcend the three lower realms or horrifying appearances of hell beings, being reborn as an animal or being reborn as a hungry, clutching ghost. Not enough to do that. We need to transcend the entire nightmare, all of its forms, not just the scary parts of the dream. We need to get lucid in this dream period. To do that, to inspire ourselves to do that, we meditate on defects of psychic existence. That's the main suggestion that Guru Rampa gives here. But in the more elaborate explanations, there are sometimes also elaborate meditations or the four truths of the Aryas, 12 links of dependent origination, and detailed analysis of our mental distortions and how they work. And all of that just further convinces us, yes, things are really wrong here. We need to fix them. We need to rebalance this mind, because right now, for as long as it's kept under the influence of confusion, things are not going to turn out well. And then with that, once we have developed this stable feeling of renunciation, the stable spirit of emergence, and of course, for that, we need loving kindness. Why would I want to transcend all of this? Because I want myself to be happy and free from suffering. Sometimes it's said that renunciation is simply self-compassion. And that's exactly what it is. Renunciation is the wish to be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. Self-compassion is the wish to be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. It's just when Buddhists talk about renunciation as described in Buddhism, they mean that it entails certain understanding of the causes of suffering as karma, mental distortions, primordial ignorance, and so forth. Whereas secular self-compassion can sometimes start with things like, well, I need a better diet. And right now I need to lie down. And I need to take that bath. And I do need to get out of this toxic relationship. And I also need to set healthy boundaries. There's nothing wrong with that level of self-compassion. It's just we can go deeper eventually. Or we can actually keep working with all these different levels. But it's important to also start where we are, because it is not a secret that we can be stuck in very toxic dynamics in Buddhist communities if we don't practice reasonable self-compassion. People who are abused by their communities or their teachers, or I don't know, all these sorts of types of things that happen because we should all be taught the skills of self-care, setting healthy boundaries, and so forth. And we're not. We're taught things like math and English literature and so forth, and those are valuable, but we should also get that basic psychological education. That's why His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, is such a huge sponsor and patron, such a influential patron of all these training modalities for adults and for children that teach those skills, social, emotional, and ethical skills of trying to be a good human who knows how to navigate the life in terms of psychology. So we're working with all of that. Eventually, renunciation will come, and then we'll come to the advanced stages of the path. And that's actually what most people like to receive teachings on, because the previous ones seem a bit boring. Well, That's how it often happens. But of course, we need to do the preliminary work, and it's already pervaded by the spirits of tenderness and loving kindness and compassion. And then in Gorampa's presentation, we reach actual, more elaborate meditations on loving kindness, now towards everyone, finally towards everyone intensely. And compassion, boundless compassion towards all beings. And we meditate on that for a long time to make it truly stable. And then bodhicitta, where we use special analytical meditation, special sequences of steps to transform the fusion of loving kindness and compassion into this incredible resolve to become a fully awakened Buddha for the benefit of all. And as Dr. Wallace sometimes describes or explains, that's called awakening mind. It can be called awakening mind. Bodhicitta can be translated in various ways, but awakening mind is a good translation because it means that our mind is now awakening from the sleep of self-obsession, and also from the sleep of ignorance for ultimate bodhicitta. But for relative or conventional bodhicitta, what we're waking up is the obsession with self-interest, absolute clinging attachment to self-interest, incredible narcissism, essentially, that can be found at the very depths of our minds. So we're doing away with that. We're waking up from that through these practices. Genuine loving kindness, now boundless. Genuine compassion, now boundless. Genuine bodhicitta. Okay, so then what do we do with that? On the basis of that, having infused our mind with this incredible loving energy, we meditate on the view, and that's the view of the actual nature of reality. And here, Gorampa gives the exact same instructions that are so brilliantly taught in 7-point mind training. So if you're joining CCN's retreat on the 7-point mind training with Lama Alam, you will be receiving these exact instructions. 3 steps for meditating on ultimate nature. Establishing appearances as aspects of the mind, establishing the mind itself as illusion, and then establishing illusion as devoid of intrinsic existence. Let the medicine be liberated, and so forth. There are different translations of that. The exact same, roughly speaking, approach is taught in the 7-point mind training, taught here by Gorampa in Parting from the Four Clingings. So that's why we see it's all parallel. It's a very quintessential, this thing with 3 steps, approach to meditating on emptiness. And we could work with that. It could be taught just in terms of the view of the middle way. It can be used to introduce us to the views of Mahamudra and Dzogchen, actually. I've heard that presentation as well multiple times. But it would be giving us a glimpse of the view. And the more we practice with it, the less our grasping, Tenpa in the original, would be arising. And grasping here can also be explained as reification, decontextualization, believing things to be real when they're not, projecting reality onto things where actually that reality is not there, and so forth. So that grasping will slowly be decreasing. Our habituation to the view will be becoming stronger and stronger, and our mind will become more and more free. And that, of course, will strengthen in a feedback loop our loving kindness, because then our loving kindness is no longer also grasping at the reality of this person. So we see the interdependence between us and others more strongly and more strongly and more strongly. And that's where there is a teaching on how loving kindness and the other immeasurables and compassion, for example, they go through 3 stages in their development. And first, we perceive real existent persons or individuals that we project loving kindness towards. Then our view shifts to that of actually seeing the dance of aggregates instead of actually existent persons. And then eventually it's the view of boundless spaciousness. And yet there's no limits to loving kindness, there's no limits to compassion, and so forth. So even though we've mastered the view, we've come very close to mastering the view, loving kindness does not disappear, it only becomes stronger. Whereas in our perception, it might seem, well, if there's no actual self-existent people, who are we, or beings, what are we projecting this wish towards? In yogic practice, there would be no obstacles. Would be no problem with that. But then, were we to try to find all the same steps in the Mondro preliminary practices so widely and so often taught in Kagyu and Nyingma traditions, so quintessential there, and that's the main presentation of the stages of the path, actually, and practically speaking, in Kagyu and Nyingma traditions, we would see all the same ideas: precious human rebirth, death and rebirth, defects of samsara, karmic causes and effects. So a slight rehashing of contemplations, but they're all still there. And they all can be very much infused or need to be practiced on the basis of a certain loving kindness for ourselves. If I think I am garbage, I don't really believe I have a precious human rebirth and that I need to do something meaningful with it. If I don't care whether I'm happy or not, I would not be motivated to think of my mortality and what comes next. Also would not be motivated to escape from the defects of samsara, to transcend them. And I would also really not care about karmic causes and effects, because if I don't care about my happiness, why would I try to build the causes for it? So it's really important to have loving kindness there, to consciously create it, cultivate it, unfold it, uncover it, unless we're very gifted in terms of self-loving kindness originally. If we're not, we do that work. But then in the uncommon preliminaries, sometimes called the 100,000-fold accumulations, and actually many masters accumulate them way more times than just 100,000, because in a way, it's not about quantity, it's about quality and profound transformation. And then quantity is just to tell us, yes, keep working with it very diligently for a very long time. It's important, or it's useful to accumulate 100,000 of each of these practices, but beyond that, we're meant to be practicing them until realization. But then that's where we meditate on refuge and truly adopt the attitude of refuge, generate bodhicitta. And when the preliminary bodhicitta is taught, that's where people would often receive special instructions on the four immeasurables and how to meditate on them. So how to meditate on immeasurable loving kindness and compassion and so forth. Quite often it's taught at that stage, in addition to already telling us, for yourself, please wish to be happy and free from suffering. This is where we're taught how to establish boundless types of these mental states. And you can see this explanation in various texts that are commentaries on these preliminary practices, elaborate commentaries, many of them translated now into English language. These texts are a bit arcane in that many of them were written in 19th century Tibet, 14th, all these ages past. And of course, there are also some modern books as well, such as a Ngondro commentary by Mingyur Rinpoche, and so forth. But the essence does not change, even though language and presentation might be adapted to a specific age and time. And so bodhicitta, that's where we meditate on the four immeasurables, and then we'll let them culminate in this boundless attitude of bodhicitta. Then mandala offering, beautiful practice, but if it's done on the basis of genuine bodhicitta, genuine four immeasurables, even more so beautiful. It's not done just moving our hand in a special way, piling up rice, then saying a prayer and so forth. No. Then the purification practice of Vajrasattva, that requires a lot of self-compassion and self-loving kindness, and also compassion and loving kindness for others. It's actually one of the conditions. One of the conditions for purifying is having genuine compassion for others. Well, where would that come from if we haven't cultivated it? That's the issue. So we do need to work with that a little bit before. Also, steps 3 and 4 are sometimes reversed. In some systems, Vajrasattva is done first, and some mandala is done first. In some systems, there are additional steps, such as mentally offering up our body, or establishing causes for Pure Land rebirth, and so forth. So some systems expand these points, some collapse them back into very few. In some cases, the formal liturgy for these practices can be several hundred pages long or dozens of pages long. And in some cases, the entirety of the liturgy for the actual practices can be just a few lines, but the essence does not change, just the outer form. And then Guru Yoga, which is often described as the very heart of the path, and that is trying to merge our mind with the boundless, timeless awareness, or primordial wisdom, or pristine awareness, not just of our outer guru as a person who's guiding us on the path, but also the ultimate guru, that is our own Buddha nature. And we practice with that. That's the essence. Although in some systems, instead of just staying with Guru Yoga and then working with the ultimate view of reality until we gain full realization, there is the added stages of working with different types of Vajrayana practices, such as different types of deity practice, this deity, that deity. The Nyingma tradition, some practitioners do accumulations associated with three types of deities called Guru, deity, and dakini. They perfect their ability to not reify. They perfect their energetic field, actually, also. They perfect their loving kindness and compassion and so forth. They further expand all these qualities by working with these different archetypal forms or these different windows into Buddha nature. And that's not always done, but that's one of the traditional Nyingma approaches. So in Vajrayana, and Vajrayana in general is a very fast way to gain insight by connecting with the ultimate result that's already present in our Buddha nature, according to some systems. In Vajrayana, we use such methods as expressing our luminous and blissful nature by thinking of a meditation deity, such as Tara, or Guru Rinpoche, or Avalokiteshvara, or even Buddha Shakyamuni, the historical Buddha. In some cases, even some Tibetan historical figures, in some cases, Indian historical figures, and in some cases, trans-historic figures that never probably existed within the cycles of time, but express our inner qualities. But let's say we practice with image of Tara, green Tara, for example. We will work with Tara's image as a window to our own Buddha nature. That's so-called deity yoga. We, through that, purify our tendency to reify, we let go of a lot of grasping. So it's all falls actually under, a lot of it falls under the fourth line. If there's grasping, there is no view. So to gain the view, we let go of grasping by working with an image that is so vastly different from what we're used to, our conventional appearances. All on the basis of love, because Garchen Rinpoche, when giving instructions on these practices, and I've had the privilege of translating one cycle like that, but also if you open Garchen Rinpoche's YouTube channel and watch any commentary on any deity practice, you would hear this point again and again. Garchen Rinpoche says the essence of all meditation deities is love. So not just loving kindness that we consciously cultivate in meditation, not just something artificial in a way. It's also love that's right there at the very depths of our Buddha nature. The same Tsewa, but now brought to its ultimate fruition. So we work with deities like that. There are also systems in Vajrayana where we work with our channels, drops, and winds, so our inner machinery, and that's both very powerful and very dangerous if we do it unskillfully. And that's where we're to read the texts on those practices after having received appropriate permissions and being guided and instructed. We would see that there's actually a strong correspondence between the four immeasurables and the four types of bliss. And we can get glimpses of those correspondences even as we read the biographies of the great Mahasiddhas of ancient India, where some of them will receive instructions from their teachers to practice the four immeasurables and the four types of bliss, correlated with each other, because everything is correlated with everything. And as we cultivate four immeasurables towards other beings, when we do appropriate practices, special types of bliss can be born within our subtle inner nervous system, and that can then be used for profound insight. But that's something I have absolutely no knowledge about. I should very clearly say that those are very advanced practices. But then beyond that, and of course, I don't know anything about that either, but that's where many of you would be familiar with. Beyond that lie systems where we are invited to eventually simply rest in an approximation of our ultimate nature, which in Mahamudra is sometimes described as cognizance and emptiness, the union of cognizance and emptiness, or the union of cognizance, emptiness, and bliss, and so forth. And Dzogchen is described as pristine awareness, or Rigpa. And within that, within Dzogchen specifically, when Rigpa is described, this ultimate dimension of our awareness, the most subtle and pure form of our awareness, is described as having three qualities. It's said to be empty, said to be luminous, so able to give rise to appearances. And it's said to possess the quality of boundless or all-pervading compassion. Kunkyap Tugje, all-pervading compassion. And that quality of all-pervading compassion is the ultimate form of the same quality we know as Tsewa, or responsiveness, or non-indifference. The difference between them is that once we have removed or worked to remove all obstacles, what is now manifesting is caring towards the puppies that we meet on the road, and ourselves when we hurt, and our friends and so forth. That responsiveness, becomes the boundless resonance pervading the entirety of existence, pervading the experiences of all beings, because the Buddha does pervade in a way. Buddha's awareness pervades the awareness of all beings. That's why Buddhists know everything that happens to us, according to some systems of explanation, I should say. So within that, what is now Tseva, basic human caring. We are mammals, and so we care. Sometimes His Holiness explains at the very end of it manifests as all-pervading compassion. And one way to practice with Rigpa that some masters emphasize, including Garchen Rinpoche, is to cultivate greater and greater levels of loving kindness, compassion, and everything, because that melts the ice of our self-grasping. And the more this ice of self-grasping melts, the more the entirety of our mind transforms into this all-pervading resonance. But because this all-pervasive resonance, this freely flowing water, is just one of the qualities of Rigpa, pristine awareness, we reach the state of pristine awareness and we go deeper and deeper and deeper into it. And then eventually, when that's all there's left, because we have allowed everything to be finally pervaded and liberated by that, that's full awakening. We have mastered the path on the basis of all the preceding steps, starting with such simple steps as, yes, wishing ourselves to be happy, holding our body in tender awareness, to not feel too horrible about it, to feel a bit of comfort, to feel a bit of liking for ourselves, and yes, to drink enough water, to go to the doctor, to take good care of ourselves. But beyond that, knowing that is already connected to the very end of the path, all-pervading compassion, to Jekunkya. And that natural progression is why Garchen Rinpoche is able to say that the cause of happiness is love, not just because love creates positive karmic causality, not just because love counteracts, love is both Tseva and Jampa, loving kindness and this primordial caring, not just because they counteract some of mental distortions, but because eventually on these advanced paths of Mahamudra and Dzogchen and associated systems, it's into that boundlessness that all types of confusion can melt. So although this presentation might seem a bit different from the more conventional presentation of we just need to cultivate wisdom to counteract our delusion, to counteract our ignorance, and the rest of it, or rest of the factors are just supportive factors, that's in a way absolutely true. There's no arguing with that. From this yogic presentation, as we are indeed cultivating wisdom, that wisdom is always pervaded by love. And that's why another one of my primary teachers, Chökyi Rinpoche, very often talks about emptiness with the heart of compassion, or compassion with a heart of emptiness. These qualities are not eventually separate, even though initially we do meditations on them separately. So we'd like to conclude this with a wonderful, wonderful quote from Garchen Rinpoche that I try to send out to everyone all the time. It doesn't matter whether one calls oneself a Buddhist or not a Buddhist. The Dharma is love. And of course, to understand what he means, we do need to remind ourselves that probably, yes, indeed, this is not about loving hamburgers. And yet, even if we think, well, this is probably also not about romantic love, this is where there's already a little bit of additional instruction from Garchen Rinpoche, who says, well, actually, when people truly love each other and truly try to practice that love, within that, the ice of their self-clinging already starts to melt. And once it starts melting, if they continue on the path, eventually, the fire of love will become stronger and stronger, and the entirety of that ice block will melt, giving rise to full awakening and freedom. That's all I have for today, and that was more than enough in terms of the timing. It's been 2 hours to the minute, and I'm very grateful for being with you here tonight. There's just one question here in the chat. Do you have any suggestions for where one could do a loving kindness retreat? Thank you. I think we are hoping to eventually love a loving kindness retreat through the Contemplative Consciousness Network. We're figuring it out, I believe, because of course, multiple pandemics now and all of that. And beyond that, that would depend on geographical location. You would see very different styles of loving kindness taught by teachers and instructors from different lineages. So for example, in the United States, you would often see annual loving kindness retreats taught in both the Insight Meditation Center in Massachusetts and in Spirit Rock Community in the Bay Area in California. But those are usually booked long in advance, quite popular as a format. And as for other countries, continental Europe and so forth, and Australia, I'm not so well familiar with that. But eventually, I hope you would be able to attend loving kindness retreat in every town, every locality, every country, everywhere, just because it would become such a huge staple in our emotional hygiene. From my side, I'm absolutely always aspiring to guide more of those because I've seen their facilitate more of those because I've seen their transformative power. So maybe one day, hopefully soon. And it's just a fun thing for me to do as well. And also the schedule I use for those is very lighthearted and a bit playful. So that's always nice because some types of retreats focused more closely on insight, for example, can be, especially some types of what is now known as Vipassana retreats, 7-day Vipassana retreats, 10-day Vipassana retreats, can be a bit heavy on people and not always trauma informed. Whereas loving kindness retreats by nature should be trauma informed because their purpose is to heal some of our trauma. So that's something to play around with. And, hopefully one day, we'll keep you informed. Please keep asking. And somewhere in the intersection of that, we'll hopefully be able to arrange something one day. Once again, my deepest gratitude to all of you. Thank you to the Contemplative Consciousness Network. For my deepest gratitude to Jude and Elizabeth for giving me the privilege of being able to teach this long-term course and this standalone session as well. My deepest gratitude to Venerable Tenzin for his tech assistance and recording this session. And of course, to all of you for being or aspiring to be beacons of loving kindness and compassion in this world. Deep bows and hoping to see you all soon. Thank you so much.